Thank you, Joachim. Along with my colleagues, I'm going to talk about aspects of the global financial crisis, including some of the channels by which the crisis will have impacts on the poor and developing countries, and talk a little bit about the issues that result from that in terms of poverty and, in particular, on social protection, topics that both Maximo and Usman have already introduced. For yet a third time this afternoon, I'm going to start off by talking about some of the channels, but I'm going to do so in a way which is slightly different from my colleagues. The first part is just a strict sort of enumeration of the channels by which the financial crisis in developed countries will affect developing countries. And in my mind, I split these out into 5 channels. They are that of trade volume, where trade volume in turn can actually be broken down, for example, into volumes with respect to manufacturers, with respect to services such as tourism, and with respect to primary commodities that Usman in particular spoke to. Separately, I think it's helpful to think about changes in the terms of trade that will result from the crisis, that are resulting from the crisis. There's the issue of remittances that Maximo alluded to briefly. There is the issue of aid flows, which has not received that much attention so far this afternoon. And finally, there's the issue of foreign direct investment. Looking across this list of primary channels by which the financial crisis in developed countries can affect developing countries, it's hard not to be struck, first of all, by the degree of heterogeneity that these channels have, particularly when we start to map them onto various countries. There are countries, for example, where remittances are actually a very, very large component of gross national income, countries in Central America, for example. Particularly in Africa, there are a number of countries which are now highly aid-dependent. Of course, we've talked a lot about trade and changes in terms of trade, but how those play out in their direct effects, again, differs very dramatically. For example, in terms of primary commodities, where, for example, which are produced using very capital-intensive means, such as oil production, the direct effect, for example, on the poor may be very limited because it's a very small, somewhat isolated segment of the population. Contrast that, for example, with manufacturers in parts of East Asia, which use very large numbers of low or unskilled labor. Even more complex, of course, are changes in terms of trade, because as these move up and down, they will affect countries in different ways. So, for example, if I am an oil-exporting country, think of countries in Africa like Angola or Gabon, the last 12 to 18 months have been pretty horrible. On the other hand, if you're a country which is reliant on the import of food, the reduction in global petroleum prices, which has been correlated for reasons discussed elsewhere, with some reductions in global food prices, have meant that in that dimension of terms of trade, there actually has been some sort of improvement. But one point I want to leave you with as we continue to consider this first slide is that assessing just the primary channels by which the global financial crisis affects the poor in poor countries is not sufficient. It's not sufficient for 3 reasons. First of all, because it neglects what some people describe as multiplier effects, what some people describe as linkages from one sector to another. So, for example, it may be the case that, let's say, oil production only employs a very small proportion of a country's labor force, but the people who work in that sector go out and buy other goods. They are a source of demand for other goods produced, particularly non-tradable goods, produced in that economy. So the extent to which there are linkages from sectors which are directly affected by the crisis to those secondary sectors will then have a much larger effect, or a very important effect, on the magnitudes of the effects on poverty and hunger. It's also important to recognize that particularly aid and trade can be important sources of government revenues. This can be the case, for example, where you have countries which rely very heavily on royalties from mining, for example, or where, for example, spending in basic social sectors is a function of aid flows. So an important consideration is not so much, in some cases, may not be the direct primary effect, but how that influences the level of government spending which can be supported domestically. And of course, related to that is the issue of, in the sense that given its level of resources, how do governments actually choose what sectors or what areas to invest in? An issue which I won't go into in part because Usman has covered it in his presentation. So this gives us some general sense of some of the channels, both primary and secondary, by which the crisis can affect the poor in developing countries. But it leaves out in some sense, well, which countries do we think might be most badly affected? And as I speak, no doubt there are macroeconomists all over Washington busily running models on this. So what I'm going to give to you is not, I think, a definitive word, but an example of this. And this is courtesy initially of the IMF, but particularly also my IFPRI colleagues, Derek Heddy and Jose Funes, who've put together, I think, a very useful map. And this is based on IMF estimates of countries at risk, or to countries which are vulnerable, given the current macroeconomic crisis. And this reflects these various channels that I was alluding to earlier. And the particular focal point, in terms of the way in which this is measured, is in terms of the overall effect on countries' balance of payments and their existing supplies of import cover. And what you see looking at this map is that countries which are most concerned are countries in this map which are illustrated in red. And those countries are dominated by almost a spine that goes up the middle of Africa. So it's countries like Congo DRC, Zambia, Sudan, Ethiopia, a few countries in West Africa, and then one or two other spots around the globe. So you can see, for example, Papua New Guinea, which is very heavily reliant on production of copper, Afghanistan, which is reliant on aid flows, and so on and so forth. So we look at this map of countries at risk and say, well, this tells us about the macro feature, where in fact at least one projection of where we think the crisis will be most strong. How does that map on to what we know about the distribution of hunger across the developing world? Well, there are a number of ways in which we could examine that, one of which, this being an IFPRI policy seminar, we could do it in terms of the Global Hunger Index that has been developed here at IFPRI. The GHI combines three measures: proportion of the population undernourished, the proportion of under 5 who are underweight, and the mortality rate for children under 5. A very simple exercise is to calculate the mean GHI for for countries which are identified as high, medium, and low risk using this IMF methodology. And what jumps out at you, if you look at the left-hand table on the slide, is that those countries at highest risk are also countries where, by this measure, and I suspect others, if we were to use others, are actually score worst. In the GHI, the higher the number, the worse off you are. So that would suggest at an international level, as a very first cut, that a focal point on countries where risk levels are high and where hunger is highest might actually be a very useful entry point. However, in fact, life is not quite so simple. And this is the second half of this, the second panel of the second table on the slide, which I put up to illustrate this. What I've done is taken the countries identified by the IMF work, which are at highest risk from the global financial crisis, and put on, in the first instance, the Global Hunger Index, the GHI. And what you see as you look across those numbers is a terrific degree of variation around that mean figure. You have countries like Congo DRC, Ethiopia, Afghanistan, where the GHI is very high. In other words, hunger is, by this measure, is very, very severe. And other countries, such as El Salvador and the Philippines, where in fact the GHI is much lower, indicating in these countries are much less. The issue of hunger is is not as right. The issue of hunger is not as severe as it is in those other countries. So one point that comes out of this is to say to direct efforts just purely based on risk levels, in some sense, is only going to be partially informative, given these degrees of differences in hunger across these. The second point or issue to note is that the underlying sources of risk at the macro level vary considerably across these countries. And again, to illustrate this, I picked out those countries on the IMF list which are at greatest risk because they are highly aid-dependent countries. And these are Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Haiti, Malawi, and Sudan. Sudan largely because of the inflows that go into aid inflows that go into Darfur. At one level, this makes, in some sense, the question of what would happen to these countries, or what are the prospects for these countries, in a sense, a very simple question, which is to say, what will be the responses or attitudes of both bilateral and multilateral donors to the crisis? If these countries, and if those countries decide, for example, to protect their existing aid flows, then that will buy a large degree of protection for at least some of these countries. And in turn, that suggests at the international level, if we look at across countries, that we could think of sort of there being several sets of countries for which we could have concern. There are countries where the Global Hunger Index is high, where they're high at risk, and where they're highly aid-dependent, where clearly the main policy issue or lever, as I mentioned, is that of trying to maintain or actually increase aid flows. There are countries where the GHI is also high, where they're also high at risk at a macro level, and they're commodity-dependent. And the concern here in countries, for example, like Mauritania and Zambia, is the impact that the collapse in commodity prices has, for example, on government revenues, and therefore the ability of governments to provide services to their population. And then finally, not shown on my slides, because I was under very strict instructions to keep this to 10 minutes, is that there are going to be other countries where the hunger index is high. Where the hunger index is high, the macro risk is medium or low, but where there are these very strong secondary channels of transmission from the shock to the poor. Now, with all that, in terms of moving from the kind of global scale to looking at the role of policies within countries, one of the points I was asked to speak to was the role of social protection. And as it's being discussed in international fora, the main focal point of the role of social protection is to protect the living standards of the poor. But importantly, I would argue that, in fact, programs or interventions that should be considered should go beyond this. And they should have two additional focal points. One of which is that they should be aimed to prevent households from falling into poverty traps. In other words, protecting households' asset levels, human capital, resource bases, and so on and so forth, from actually falling below the critical level at which it's next to impossible for households to subsequently grow. They should also be designed, for example, that they will actually contribute to recovery and to longer-term growth. So, for example, labor-intensive public works on infrastructure is an example of this. The core point that I want to stress of the second and third bullet points is the following, is rather than seeing there being a competition between expenditures on social protection and longer-term growth, we should see these as being complementary. And so these discussions of social protection are not necessarily discussions of social protection per se, but they're also discussions about raising the foundations for long-term economic growth. Now, that all sounds kind of abstract, and so I thought I'd end my discussion with the tale of two countries. These two countries are not picked at random, but they're two countries which in the 1990s experienced very severe macro crises, certainly on the order, if not stronger, than the size of the shock which we're currently dealing with. One of these countries was Mexico, which experienced a macro crisis in the mid-1990s. And at the level of social protection, the government's ultimate response was to actually revamp existing social protection programs. So those of you who have heard Santiago speak will know that this was the time in which the conditional cash transfer program Progressa was implemented. And at the same time, the government eliminated and scaled back very poorly performing subsidies. The consequence of all this is in response to the crisis, the government improved its targeting of social protection programs, while at the same time actually reduced the share of government expenditures that went on social protection. My second country is that of Indonesia, which, as you know, experienced the East Asian financial crisis in 1998. The government response there was somewhat more ad hoc. There was, for a while, a rice subsidy scheme. There was what has been described in a number of publications as, quote, a crash program of public works that were not particularly well coordinated across the country. Well, what were the consequences of these social protection responses in these two countries, given these shocks? And what I thought I'd do to illustrate this is to graph rural poverty rates before, during, and after the crises in these two countries. What you see looking at both these graphs is that as the shock unfolds in both countries, in Indonesia and in Mexico, rural poverty, as measured by the head count, increases substantially. In both countries, an increase on the order of about 12 percentage points. But there's a difference in terms of what happens to the subsequent path of rural poverty over time. In Mexico, it takes a while, but gradually rural poverty, up to the end of my graphs, actually goes back to its pre-crisis levels. Indonesia, in fact, the level of rural poverty does not return to its pre-crisis levels. Now, some of you are saying, surely I'm not suggesting that, in fact, that there's a strong correlation between an appropriate and a poorly designed social protection program, but I just want to throw it out as a suggestion that, in fact, there could be something to that. More generally, I want to leave you with two messages or ideas for further discussion. The first one being is that the policy response to the global financial crisis, which includes the social protection response, must recognize the heterogeneity of effects that exist both across and within countries. And second, the social protection component should, there's an extra knot in there. The social protection component should be designed to both mitigate current shocks while laying the foundation for sustainable recovery. It should not be an ad hoc response. Thank you.